Good afternoon, everybody. We will begin the webinar shortly at 2 p.m. Good afternoon, everybody. We'll be starting the webinar shortly at 2 o'clock. Good afternoon, everybody. We'll be starting the webinar in just around 1 minute. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Perfect Cybersecurity Storm, in collaboration with Sonicwall. We will start today's webinar with a presentation from Alex Michael, Systems Engineer Manager at Sonicwall, who will discuss the findings of Sonicwall's latest cyber threat report. Over to you, Alex.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your time. Today, we're going to talk about the Sonicwall Cyber Threat Report 2021. It's a threat report that we release biannually, and it makes for a mandatory reading, I think, especially in this sort of environment. Okay, so let's kick off. Let's talk. What is the threat report? Okay, so the threat report isn't just a bunch of clever guys sat around in the room, sticking their finger in the air and saying, it's this. There is some thinking and some intelligence behind it, as I'm sure you can imagine. In this particular, for our particular threat report, we gather data. I think that's obvious. We have over a million sensors worldwide, and the traffic and the threats are picked up. They're anonymous sensors. All the data that we have is sent to the Capture Labs team, and they process this, and it's the same data that we use to build our signatures for our antivirus, but we also take that and we build a comprehensive database of what's going on, and here we are, and that's where our threat report comes from. Okay, so particularly interesting is this threat report. So we're unlike previous threat reports, we didn't have the specter of COVID and lockdown hanging over us. So the way that we behave, the way that we work, I'm sure there isn't a single person here that hasn't been affected by that. It's changed, and that's been noticed in the threat report. We tend to see trends in the threat report, as with each one that we release. This has been the biggest change, as it were, and we'll go through that in detail as we progress through the slides. Okay. Good. Right. So let's talk about the general trends. And what I should probably add is that this threat report has been reduced down for the time that we've got, and it's fairly comprehensive. And you know, the Mark and the team will circulate the full copy later on. But for me, I've picked the pertinent parts, and you know, we would just want to start with the trends and what's up and what's down. Okay, and you could probably see from here, you know, how lockdown has affected these sort of these increases and indeed decreases. So malware attacks down. Okay, so, I mean, you know, why is that? I want to talk about the behavior shortly, and that's not necessarily, you know, we shouldn't be celebrating and sitting on our laurels and you know, thinking that everything's good again. You know, the attacks are more targeted, more aimed, which means you don't need to cast the net wide, or at least that's how the hackers are thinking. And you know, they know that they can make these dedicated, more well created attacks to get access to our network. So that would reflect that. Encrypted threats are up. I mean, that makes sense. You want to hide your attack. You know, if it's encrypted, if your connection is encrypted, if the file is encrypted, you know, that's more likely to be successful. Increase in intrusion attempts, that's a year-on trend. You're always going to see that. What's interesting is the next two, crypto tracking and ransomware. And we'll go into detail in a bit, but you know, and we could probably speculate why that those two are increasing. But the answer is money. But let's, you know, I'll cover those in detail shortly. And the obvious one, IoT, Internet of Things attacks. With a lot of us working from home, it sort of makes sense that, you know, the targets for the attacks are going to be, you know, a different caliber. We all probably have some IoT devices at home, maybe the odd camera, maybe the odd appliance. You know, these are potential targets. They can be used to springboard into the rest of the network, or they could even be used as in a recruitment drive for a botnet army. So it sort of makes sense that as the hackers probe, you know, our home slightly less protected networks, that you'll find more there. Okay, but let's just go into detail with some of those things. So look, if you look at that spike there around about March of last year, there was a massive drop in the number of connections and a number of hits that they're seeing. Now, this is the interesting part about lockdown. Fewer of us are in the offices, and what does that mean? It means that, you know, if these offices are empty and our perimeter firewall, in this case Sonicwall, was sat there, and if they're not taking hits because the connections are being initiated from the home user, then, you know, we won't be able to take that data and gather it. It might be that your home network isn't protected by a Sonicwall solution that has that information. So, you know, there's data there that is missing. So where we see that malware, you know, the number of malware hits is dropping because of the specific nature and the targeted nature of the attack. It's also a case of these empty offices mean that, you know, we're not seeing some of these hits. But what this should emphasize, the message here is, are we protecting our home workers or maybe our remote workers like we would our office? The perimeter, you know, has been forever. It's been pushed out. The trend was always heading there, but I think now we need to focus that more than ever. Okay. Good. So look, and ransomware, it is the main crux of it. I suppose in my day to day, I hear more about ransomware from customers. You know, obviously you see a lot of it in the news, and Sonic will report new variants all the time. And so it's probably not surprising that we see a 62% increase, because it's something that can be monetized. You know, encrypting someone's files, even, you know, on the small scale, someone's encrypting a home user's photographs, something that's quite valuable to us, and demanding a Bitcoin or something like that. And on the other hand, that you know, there are databases. So via the home user, a hacker, a would-be hacker is going to jump, you know, springboard and jump across a VPN, perhaps across a shared link, into the office, and then encrypt servers with that lateral traffic. So, you know, that's a huge increase, and it's something that we can't ignore. And there's right at the end, I'll give you an idea of what we can do to help with that. Okay, office files, that continues to be the preferred method of getting access or infecting us as users. And you know, it makes sense. It's stuff that we sort of take for granted. It's stuff that we use the most. You know, if the file is archived, it's another layer of a way of hiding that file. Okay, so that it's unlikely to see that trend, especially with services like Microsoft 365. We're heavily dependent. I mean, I think if you had a look at all of your attachments over a certain period of time, I imagine that it will all be Office files. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, this is something that remains dear to my heart with someone who has a networking background. We're seeing a lot of attacks through non-standard ports. Now, what does that mean for the non-technical? Well, different applications use different port numbers when they transport across networks, okay? And a lot of those are registered, and we call them the standard ports. Now, a lot of security solutions will only scan those known ones, and then you have a whole bunch of non-standard ports that we're not looking at. So we're not looking for a certain type of port number in those packets. Now, what that means is that all a hacker has to do is make sure the traffic comes in on a connection with a non-standard port, and a lot of security solutions won't protect against it. The fact that we see an increase shows you what the mindset of a would-be hacker, try and expose that vulnerability. Okay, so it's very important. The solution has to protect against non-standard ports. I mean, I talked a little bit about encrypted threats. It just makes sense. If I think about when I first started with Sonicwall all those years ago, X amount of traffic was encrypted, and you'll see this with your address bars when you punch in HTTPS. That's an encrypted connection, but that wasn't always the case. And I think around about now it's between 80 and 90% of internet traffic is encrypted. But so it just goes to show, if you're not inspected encrypted traffic, if you do not have a solution that can act as a man in the middle to break down, decrypt that traffic, perform those sort of scans, antivirus, application awareness, then you're giving it a free pass. You're letting it through your network. Okay, it's something that's and that's not going away. Encrypted traffic is we're always going to see that hit our networks. Okay, so what are we doing about this to protect against it? Well, Sonicwall in particular use a technology called Rtdmi, real-time deep memory inspection. It's a bit of a mouthful. Now, what this technology was recently patented this year. It's something that we've had since 2018. The patent was made available this year, and what it does, it's not just your typical sandbox. It is a technology whose sole purpose is to expose malware. So we will trick the malware in the attachment to reveal itself, and then what we can do is we can block it or alert for it, and then make sure that it's never before seen again. So I'll use the expression "never before seen." This is where you get your value for a technology such as this. It's all well and good if we have an antivirus or a signature-based solution, but if someone created a ransomware, a day ago, and you were the first target, as ridiculous as it sounds, you do hear stories, and there are cases of this happening. It's very easy to build ransomware these days, and there's nothing to stop a would-be hacker, customizing it to make it, new, as it were. So if a new ransomware was sent to us and it's never before seen, well, what do we do? So what Rtdmi does, it will detonate that file. It will do various tests on it, and what it will do, it will find out what the threat is, and it can do this in rapid time, and it will then respond to the Sonicwall solution and say, this is a virus. We've spotted it for the first time. We're not going to let it have access to your network. And if you see there, 268,000 never before seen variants in 2020, that's a huge number. If you didn't have a technology like Rtdmi, that threat is getting through to your endpoint. It's as simple as that. Another key thing to note about real-time deep memory inspection is that it's a technology that underpins all of our solutions. Okay, so it isn't just our firewalls, the traditional perimeter. It is our endpoint. It is our mobile access. It is our SaaS solution. So that's our CAS solution, where we use Rtdmi to scan files that you might share in Microsoft 365 or even Dropbox. And that in itself is, there's an advantage, because it means you're dealing with that threat before it even comes close to your endpoint, whether that's your home or whether it's in the office. Okay, so as well as our email security, Rtdmi is a solution that you need to have. And look, I haven't included the slide here, but we recently had a report of the 100% effectiveness of Rtdmi. So it's something that we're quite proud of. Okay, so look, just to summarize, ransomware, that's the key thing. Ransomware and cryptojacking, and look, it might be that there are newly appointed hackers. That's probably not the right expression, but hackers who have just taken on the mantle of penetrating your network, because it could be that the lockdown has affected them. Maybe they're not working anymore. Maybe they're on furlough. It's an opportunity to to make some money, as unfortunate as it sounds. So that's it's one of the reasons. So these are two elements. And the price of crypto coin, I know if you follow it fairly recently, there has been a dip. That's kind of typical, I guess. But it's still a valuable commodity. So having a crypto coin and the ability to gain crypto coin through ransomware and cryptojacking, it really, you can understand why it's appealing. As I've mentioned already, office files, IoT. Never, just to add to that, never assume that your IoT is protected. We're going back a fair few years, and obviously I'm a IT security professional. Or I like to think I am. I've had a web camera that an unnamed brand web camera doing some testing on, and I've seen that compromised on a lockdown network purely because of the way it doesn't hide its default username and password. Easily resolved. Nothing, no harm was done. You could say it was a honeypot experiment, but it goes to show that some of these technologies, they may not be well protected. We've all heard stories of. I certainly have of colleagues taking over neighbors' fridges with IP addresses with insulting messages. Please ask me after in the Q&A if you want some more detail. So IoT, you have to protect yourselves. Okay, they could be the inroad to bringing down your network. Okay, so that's the general summary. Look, the threat report, it comes in a lot more detail, a lot more articulate than I've managed to portray. So look, the team are going to share that threat report with you. I hope that little snippet was useful, and I look forward to your questions. So Mark, if that's okay, and unless you've got anything to add, it's over to you.
No, thank you very much for that, Alex. Really do appreciate it. Very insightful. I'm going to swap over to my screen now and share my own presentation. So let's bring that live. Okay, so what I'm going to be running through today is our own cybersecurity assessment survey that we've been carrying out with customers earlier in the year. We sent out the survey and assessment so that our customers could rate themselves against a variety of statements so that we could determine the level of confidence that people have in their own security investments out in their own IT estates. Because of course, it's very easy to look at these things and maybe have some audits, maybe have some reviews, but the way that we went about our assessment was to really put some statements in front of people to say, do you feel comfortable and confident that you have the technologies in place that you need in order to make sure that you have the security to protect your environment? So we put forward a range of different questions and a range of different statements, and it asked people to rate how confident they felt that they had suitable solutions in place, giving people the opportunity to say whether they felt confident, not confident at all, or unsure. Now we've got the raw data on the screen here, but I think it's a little bit easier to have a nice graph so that we can just sort of look at this in a slightly more easy to understand way. And what we've got here up at the top is the areas where people felt pretty confident, where the vast majority of people agreed that they had a decent solution in place, all the way down to the bottom where people felt less confident, or where we had more people pretty certain that they didn't have something good in place. Now up here at the top, we've got solutions like having good vulnerability analysis systems in place, good backup and recovery in place. With vulnerability analysis, we asked people, where are we? It's down here, vulnerability analysis. Our antivirus solution is constantly analyzing our systems for vulnerabilities. So I think most people probably are going to say that they agree with that, because of course antivirus is one of those basics of cybersecurity. It's something that's been hammered home for a long time, that you have to have good antivirus on all your systems. So it's no surprise that the vast majority of people would turn around and say, yep, we've got a good system in place. Similar with backup and recovery. We all know that we need a decent backup solution in place. to protect us not just against data corruption or accidental deletion, but of course, things like ransomware. If something comes into your system and encrypts your data, one of the first things that you're going to want to be able to think about is, well, can I just restore from backup? So having those data protection solutions in place, again, one of the basics. Of course, there are some people who say, no, I'm still not sure, or I disagree, because of course there is room in some environments where you might have an old antivirus solution. You're not sure if it's working. Maybe you haven't looked at it in a while, or maybe you're a small business and you don't have the luxury of your own IT department, because this is where the advantage of things like managed antivirus or managed backup might help to give you some confidence here that you do have those solutions in place. Now, we don't have time to go through every single one of these items today, so instead I'm going to sort of concentrate on the bottom 5. And what we're going to do today is really have a look at these areas and have a look at just a few ideas as to some of the solutions that you might put in place. So this is you, if you fall into that category of being unsure, or you know that you don't have a solution in place and you're thinking, well, what can I do to improve? Then we can hopefully give you some ideas today as to what you might need, as well as sort of outline, well, why it might be important that you look at some of these areas. So without further ado, I'm going to start with these bottom 2, access control and data encryption. These are the statements that we put in front of people in our assessment surveys. For access control, our systems fully support access control so that in the event of data leakage, we can block it from happening in real time and tag the data for assessment in the future. And we enable our users to share data, which is encrypted whilst in transit, even when working outside of our corporate VPN. So a lot of people feeling that they don't have a solution for this, or that they're not sure what they have in place. Now, realistically, when we're looking at access control, we're talking about, well, who's got access to data? Who can access the data? And increasingly, this is something that we need to think about because, of course, with the rise in home working and the future of work expected to be very much hybrid working, where we're going to have some people in the office, some people at home, some people out and about, people mixing it up, coming into the office some of the time, being at home some of the time, your data is going to be ending up in many, many more places. It's going to be all over the place. It's going to be on people's hard drives. It's going to be on people's smartphones and tablets. People are going to be attaching it to emails increasingly, maybe uploading it to personal cloud storage. Your data is going to be in more places. So what control do you really have over it? Well, this is where we think about, maybe the first thing that people think about is, well, I've got some permissions, right? My data, like files, sits on a server or maybe in a cloud, and there's some permissions attached to that. But of course, the permissions only really apply to the data whilst it's at rest. The moment you open a file, or the moment you copy a file down to your machine, the permissions don't come along for the ride. The file is now down on your machine and you can do whatever you want to it. You can email it to people, you can send it to people who don't normally have permissions. So the permissions don't come along for the ride. And of course, that means that we can then transfer that data wherever we want, email it as an attachment, upload it to a personal cloud, put it onto an external USB drive, and the permissions don't follow that data around. Because this is one of the reasons why there is so much room for things like human error, which of course makes up the bulk of a lot of data breaches that are reported to the ICO, for example. But of course, if our data is in more places, there's more scope for hackers and other malicious actors to have visibility of that data. And they could exploit that for all sorts of different purposes. So keeping control of your data is important. So what can we do about this? What sort of solutions can we consider to help here? Well, one of the things that we might look at is things like device-based protection. So what we're really looking at here is the moment you transfer some data down to your machine, we want the operating system to know that that's coming from trusted sources in your environment. If you're transferring a file from a server or from corporate cloud environments, we want the operating system to go, that's corporate data, we need to keep control of it, even though we've transferred it away from those trusted repositories. So we might, for example, apply some encryption to the file. So now the file is secure. It's down on your machine, but it's been secured. You can work with the file inside trusted applications, say Microsoft Office programs, for example, but we can set some rules around that as well. We can tell the operating system not to allow the transfer of that data outside of the organization, for example. So we might say we want to block it from being uploaded to personal cloud, or we want to prevent it being put onto a USB key. And this is a bit more sophisticated than just, blocking a USB port, for example. If somebody gives you a USB key with some data on that you need, if you've blocked the USB drive, well, you can't read that data. If we're protecting the data, we can be a bit more granular. You can say, yeah, plug in a USB key, but if you want to put corporate data onto that, we're going to stop you from doing that. The operating system is going to get in the way. It might even prevent you from taking screenshots, for example. So we can start to secure the data. And by the way, this is going beyond simple BitLocker controls. Whole disk encryption is important, but what that's going to do for you is it's going to protect you if someone steals your laptop and takes the hard drive out, plugs it into their computer to try and read the data. This is going to protect the data itself against software-based leaking of the data outside the environment. Now, another technique that we could look at is file-based protection, where we actually start to apply some security to the file itself, wherever it goes, at rest, on a server or cloud, down on your machine. And that can include things like, again, encryption with some permissions attached, so that the data is secure wherever it goes. You know, if it's transferred down to your machine, that security comes along for the ride. And in this scenario, even if we transfer the data outside of the organization, again, as an attachment to personal cloud, USB storage, we're allowed to do that, but the file is still secure. So if the file lands with someone that shouldn't have access to that data, they're not on the permissions list, well, now they can't open the file. So the security is following the file around. You accidentally email a file to the wrong person, you've got a safety net there that's going to prevent them from having access to that data. This even protects you in scenarios where a user uploads copies of files into personal cloud. As long as they've got valid corporate credentials, they can access the data. But if they leave the business, for example, and you revoke and remove their user account, well, their credentials are no longer valid. So now they can't access the file. They've got a copy of the data in their personal cloud, they can't access it. So we can start to apply some security here that follows the data around wherever it goes. So these are some of the things that you might want to think about when you're thinking about access control, thinking about protecting access to your data, thinking about how we're securing this, because we're no longer able to just have the comfort of saying everything inside the firewall is secure. Well, people are in the firewall, they're outside the firewall, they're working with data in all sorts of different ways, in all sorts of different places. We can take some control by zeroing in on the key asset here, the data itself. Now, the next area on our list that I'm going to look at here is ensuring compliancy. Again, the statement that we put to our customers here was maintain the correct level of compliance for our organization. We ensure our data is safe and secure, and we can supply an audit report on demand. Now, compliancy is, of course, a very complex area that can include various different compliancy standards and can include laws, things like GDPR. The term compliancy, when it comes to things like GDPR, is perhaps a misnomer. You know, it's not like ISO 27001 where you get to voluntarily rate yourself against a standard that you'd like to attain. With GDPR, it's a law. You're either breaking the law or you're not. If you're breaking the law, well, that could be reported if somebody finds out about that. So nevertheless, you've still got to figure out if you're doing the right things to protect the data and to handle the data in the right way. It's not just security, it's data handling. So one of the first things that you might want to do is identify the compliancy areas and standards that you want or need to work with. There might be certain voluntary standards that you're looking to achieve, but there might also be certain laws that you are, of course, mandated to comply with because it's the law. So you're going to want to identify what those are and then work up your policies around this first. Now, I've put that as very much the first step. So many organizations get this wrong by just making it an IT department problem and saying, oh, compliancy, that's an IT thing. No, it's a whole business enterprise. You've got to look at this as something that everybody needs to get involved with, because at the end of the day, it's not just about security around storing of data. It's also about processes and handling of data and making sure everybody's aware of their obligations. So work up your policies first, and then look to utilize the right technology tools to help you achieve that. The tools are there to help you implement your policies, but you've got to know what those are first. It might be some of the access controls we saw previously, or it might be other tools that you want to use in your IT tool bag. Leverage cloud services and audit reports. Many cloud services, including some of the major providers, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, they're going to have a lot of compliancy standards anyway. They're going to have a lot of standards that they've already met, and they're going to have a lot of audit reports that they can provide. Microsoft, for example, have a trust center where you can view independent audit reports so that you can see what Microsoft are doing in order to help protect your data. You've still got to do something. You've got to make sure that you're handling the data in the right way. But this is another area where some of the cloud tools can help. So Microsoft, again, for example, have compliancy dashboards and compliancy centers where you can work through what your obligations are and figure out what you need to do to meet those standards. So these tools are available to help you and help you figure out what you need to do to meet these standards. The next area is managing corporate-owned devices. Again, the statement here was we have systems in place that allow us to remotely manage and control corporate-owned devices that may never or will never connect to our corporate network. Now, this was an interesting one because actually we find that more people said that they had better systems in place for bring your own device. Now, the statement there for BYOD was we allow users to access our corporate data securely via their personal endpoint devices. I think a lot of people probably answer that question with a high degree of confidence because they probably think, well, we've got a VPN, so that's secure, right? Well, there might be certain things that you still need to take into account there. We'll have a look at that in a moment. When it comes to managing corporate devices, well, again, if we're thinking about devices that are never on the network, well, normally when you're on the network, you might think about Windows PCs and laptops and say, well, we have things like Active Directory and group policy, traditional solutions for managing identity, managing access, implementing configuration controls onto the device. But when your devices are outside of the network, they're no longer necessarily in contact with the server anymore to be receiving new policies, new configuration settings. You might have a VPN, but how frequently are the devices connecting to that? Do you have good confidence there? What you probably want to be looking at is cloud-based solutions, cloud identity management, cloud endpoint management solutions that can provide those policies down to the machines wherever they are, and all they need to be receiving, at least periodically, is an internet connection to get the latest policies, check in and install those settings. That might be the Microsoft solution. It might be things like Azure Active Directory or Microsoft Intune. But things like Windows 10 are fairly open, so now you can use other solutions from other vendors if you so choose. And of course, many of these solutions, including Microsoft's, will incorporate other operating systems and other platforms. So you might have one platform that's doing the identity and device management across Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, whatever you've got as a mix in your environment. These solutions can be put in place. And you'll probably be able to use the same solutions to address BYOD. Remember, a VPN only secures the connection. It doesn't necessarily mean that the endpoint is secure. With something like a management solution, a cloud management solution, you can be assessing the endpoint. You can be respecting user privacy with that, because if it's their device, you need to think about that. But if it's just a VPN, users can still do what they want with the data. You might not have so much opportunity to protect that. It could provide a conduit for malware and hackers. So if the only security solution you've got in place for BYOD is a VPN solution, have a think about what else you might need to implement in order to provide some security over the endpoint. The final area that I'm going to look at is network traffic inspection capabilities. Again, the statement here, the firewall solution we have in place allows us to engage in deep packet inspection as our traffic passes through without impacting throughput. As we heard from Alex earlier, it's so very important these days to make sure that we're able to inspect traffic, even encrypted traffic, because the vast majority of traffic going over the internet these days is encrypted. Most legitimate websites are now using full site encryption. So if you don't have a solution that can inspect that traffic, you're just not able to see what's going on inside the data. And again, as we heard from Alex, you can't just rely on the port numbers. You've got to know what's inside those data packets. So firewalls are having a much tougher job now, but the firewalls are out there. The technologies are in place to allow us to inspect that traffic. Full deep packet inspection is essential. We need to know what's going on inside the data. We need to know what's inside those packets. We need to not be trusting that the port numbers are going to tell us everything, because they just won't. So we need to know what's going on inside there. And throughput is going to be critical to the user experience. If the firewall isn't up to the job and it's going to be slowing us down, then we're going to be delivering a poor user experience. And to be honest, you don't have to choose. A decent firewall, it's not going to be making you choose between inspecting the traffic or delivering good performance. There are plenty of products out there, including, of course, Sonicwall's own next generation firewalls, that are going to handle that job. And so you don't need to choose. You can absolutely have a performance solution and do deep packet inspection at the same time. So these are certainly things to think about when you're reviewing your firewall solution and confirming that it does deliver what you require. Now that brings me to the end of my segment. Obviously, if you have any questions around this, we are open for those, and we'll have a look at seeing if we can answer some of them on the chat today. So what I'm going to do is have a quick look at some of the aspects here. So we've got one person asking for a little bit more information about IoT. What does IoT stand for? Alex, can you share a little bit more insight into how businesses have been using IoT? Because I know that over the last few years, IoT was a bit of a growth area for a lot of people. Where do you see people implementing IoT primarily in their businesses? What kind of fields? Is it primarily in factories, or is it in a wide variety of different areas? And what's the sort of primary security concern that you see most people needing to focus on?
Okay, no, it's a good question. We touched on it a little bit with the threat report, and there is a detailed section in there for a bit more detail later on. I think the recent focus, just to cover that off again, is the IoT that we have in the home, as it is a method of accessing that VPN, that tunnel to tunnel connection that potentially you could have back into the HQ. So that seems to be the main focus of the target. Again, it's a botnet army waiting to happen. On the one end, it's someone can see through my camera, or can lower the temperature in my fridge. At the other end, it's here's a denial of service. That's going to bring down your network. At the business end, I think you got it right. So factories who have these temperature control elements. I mean, we call them SCADA. Sometimes it's defined as SCADA, SCADA. Don't ask me how to define it, but in the Sonicwall in particular, we have an application categorization specifically for that. So, IoT, just to repeat, Internet of Things, it's a device that can have an IP address that can be on the network, and therefore that can participate on network communications. So, if it's these factory elements that can be compromised, well, that can cause all sorts of havoc. And again, these individual nodes, just they may not be as secure as a laptop, which has a built-in antivirus or a built-in firewall. They might just be very simply a TCP stack that is accessible. I mean, does that answer the question, Mark?
I was going to say, one of the things that I've heard about as well is that there's a lot of these devices that sometimes they're just sensors, or they're just devices where people are implementing. In some cases, they're just throwing on some software and just shoving it out there. And a lot of the time, vulnerabilities that in modern mature operating systems, Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, things, even Linux, that they were fixed years ago, but these devices are now being thrown out there, and in some cases, old school attacks that used to be, something that the door was closed on a long time ago, and now being opened up again. Because they're being put out there by different manufacturers that maybe don't have that long-term history of developing software, and they're getting into this, and they're making sort of mistakes that other vendors fixed years ago, and so old attacks are becoming new again in some of these IoT devices.
That's a good point. Yeah, and look, it's a reaction thing. So a lot, like you said, the established products and operating systems, they've seen it before. They've had to deal with it, whether it was proactively or as a response to an attack, and it's just not in the forefront of a device like this, which is quite small. It's quite cheap, typically, and it's usually an additional feature to an appliance to have an IP address.
Not focus security didn't come high enough in the priority.
A question. We're obsessed with. Sorry, Mark. We're obsessed with managing things with apps, aren't we? And to accommodate us, the products, so they can accommodate that ask. There we go. Here's a wireless card. Join it to a network, and here's a control mechanism. But there is a lot more to it. I hope that adds a bit more detail to it.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah. Another question is, how do we make sure that only managed devices are accessing our cloud services? This is something that we get asked on a semi-regular basis. We get customers who have cloud services, 365, for example, and they want to make sure that only their devices are able to access the resources like Microsoft 365, that kind of thing. So I guess I'll field this one because it's the case that not everybody necessarily wants to implement open access for Microsoft 365 from home. They don't necessarily want people using personal devices. They might want to restrict it to corporate devices that have been issued. So this is probably where, again, you're going to find some value in some sort of cloud management solution, because with things like Microsoft 365, for example, you could use things like conditional access to do this. So between Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Intune, for example, you could implement something to do this. So Azure AD is the identity management solution, so it's the thing that's managing your logins, and Microsoft Intune is managing the devices. Now, if you've issued your corporate devices and they are fully enrolled and Intune has visibility on them, well, what you'll be able to do is define some compliancy policies here. And you'll be able to say, well, only my corporate devices that I've issued to my users are going to be compliant. We can judge that in Intune, and then we can set a conditional access rule to say that only compliant devices should be permitted to access corporate resources, i.e. your cloud services and other software and data. So that'd be a route that you could take to ensure that only your corporate devices have access, because of course, these days we're not in a situation where it's like, well, you're inside the office and therefore you're on the network and therefore chances are you're a trusted device. Now we've got people able to access data from anywhere, from the cloud, and you absolutely are able to use conditional access to set some rules about who can have access to the data, what they can have access to, from what location they can access the data, and indeed what device from which they can access the data. And if you want to define that it has to be a trusted device, you can absolutely do that. So I hope that answers the question. Got a question, I think, for both of us here, Alex. I think we'll have to pick something. What's the biggest security challenge that I need to think about in 2021 versus 2019? So obviously there's a lot changed over the last couple of years. So do you have anything there that you would say is sort of like the hot challenge of 2021 in the sort of pandemic, and maybe as we move into the post-pandemic world, hopefully, versus where we were in 2019 before all of this kicked off?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully is the right word. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I touched on this with the threat report, and that is, look, it was always heading there, this remote working, and we were seeing it before, 2019 and earlier. We were seeing this steady trend with customers who thinking, actually, we're going to start working from home, or we're going to have a rotation, some staff from home, and so on, and that's great. Now, what that abrupt lockdown did to us is that we had to suddenly do it overnight. So thought wasn't put into it, and then a whole connectivity project started, and we were certainly busy, but the security was an afterthought. So and that should have been front and center. So the biggest security thing for post 2019 is locking down these remote connections, and how do you do that? You would have heard expressions like zero trust. And you touched on it, Mark, on your piece there. Gone are the days where you go, hey, I fire up a VPN, I'm going to get dropped into the network, and that's it. The terrible analogy that I would use, and no one's corrected me yet, so I'm still using it. It's like having a burglar, having to bypass a front door, but then once they're inside, you're like, okay, fine, you got past that door. However you've done it, maybe I left the door open, and you've given them free access to all the rooms and all your jewelry and your candy selection. I don't know why I picked that, but there we go, it's out there. But what should happen is that even when that burglar is in the house, there are other aspects you can lock down. What room can that person access? If it is a burglar, they shouldn't be able to get to any of them. If it's a trusted person, the resident, mum, dad, kids, whatever, they're going to get access to their room. So based on, zero trust allows us to define policy to where they can access, and that's going to be the key thing, right? It's policy based access to from anywhere. So being able to access from home or on the go, but when you do access that, it's absolutely locked down. That's my that's the big thing. I imagine that's going to keep me busy for the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally agree with you there that I think people can do a lot to enhance their own security of, your estate here can include the cloud, it can include your on-premises servers. Once people are in, how much free reign are you giving them? Because if you're giving them free reign, you could inadvertently be giving a hacker free reign as well. That if there are no further challenges to access, then you're giving them free reign. And of course, I think with device management, it's going to be the foundation for so much to be able to ensure that we have a conduit to deliver security protection down to the device, make sure that we can push the antivirus agents down, make sure that we can confirm that they're continuing to work. So all of these things are very important to focus on the endpoint and make sure that that is protected and secure wherever it is. And then the inverse side of that is, what is it that you're trying to protect? And I always sort of say to people, well, the biggest thing that you've got, your key digital asset, is your data. So for me, I suppose the biggest thing to think about in 2021 versus 2019 is your data, because it's going to be in more places. With so many people working from home, the increased likelihood of data flying around all over the place is just much greater. Oh, I need this file. Oh, email me a copy of it. Oh, I need to gain access to this data from home. I'll just download some of it to my machine. All of these things are going on to a much greater extent, and it only increases the possibility of A, accidental data breach, human error, and B, it increases the surface area where data is stored, that if a hacker got visibility of that, they could exploit it. If you've got data on your machine and it includes, I don't know, invoice details, bank account numbers, whatever, well, hackers will exploit that for all sorts of different reasons. Does that give them information on the profile of your business and people that they could start targeting with phishing attacks? Does it give them direct access to banking information? So data is important, not to mention the fact that someone could hold you hostage just over personally identifiable information and say, well, you're being cavalier with your data, I could report you to the ICO, give me some money so I won't. So there's all sorts of different reasons why hackers or malicious actors could take advantage of your data. So keeping control of that data wherever it goes is going to be quite important, making sure that if data is flowing down to a device, that it is automatically flagged as corporate data and protected, making sure that data that contains sensitive information is protected so that it's secure wherever it goes, so that it doesn't matter if it slips out on an email. I mean, obviously you want to try and prevent these things in the first place, and you can put in multiple controls around your data to try and help with this. But even if you had a data breach, if the file that lands with someone is encrypted, well, that's going to be a hell of a lot better than the file landing with someone and just being unencrypted and open for anybody to read. So there are a variety of protections that you can think about and make some assessments around. Obviously, you need to do some assessment around what data you're storing, who needs to have access to it, what's the sensitive data, what's not sensitive, etc. Because there's a variety of things to look at there. But sometimes it does well to put yourselves in the shoes of a malicious person and say, well, if this data were to become accessible to basically a criminal, could they do something with it? Would that be bad for me? And these are the questions that you have to ask yourselves, because hacking over the years has certainly evolved from people just messing around and seeing what they can do into real crime. And that's where we get the exploitation and the extortion of ransomware and other phishing attacks and all sorts of things that people are trying to do to take advantage of what they can see. They're not just there purely to mess around with your network. They're there to exploit your key digital asset, which is your data. So that's probably the biggest area I would say that I would encourage people to place some focus around.
Can I just, sorry, Mark, just got one little layer just to add on top of that. And you hit that point with, the user, the vulnerable user making a mistake. And I get asked a lot, hey, I've got this all singing, all dancing, and, insert security device, i.e. a firewall. Why do I need this endpoint, and why do I need to educate my users if I'm doing this? And the fact is, your approach has to be layered, has to be. And I think it's key that when you mention the user error, I mean, look, hey, we're all fallible. Lord knows I'm reminded of it every day. All it needs is one slip up. So everything could be absolutely, top of the state of the art technology, well thought out process and policy to deploy it. Yeah, but if all it needs is one person to make a mistake because they didn't quite go through it, and then that's it. So you've got to cover all those layers. Let's not focus all our time on one of those solutions. Let's do it on all of those, especially now with the perimeter exploding like it is. So I just wanted to sort of chuck that on top, Mark. Very important element to add.
Totally agree. Totally. we're going to bring it to a close there, everybody. If you do have further questions, you can absolutely get in contact with us and pose any further questions that you have. I'd like to thank Alex Michael of Sonicwall for joining us today. We will be sending out a copy of the presentation. We will also be sending out copies of the cyber reports from both ProBrand and Sonicwall. And if you haven't completed our cyber survey assessment yourself, then we'll also be sending the links out for that as well, so you can see how you measure up. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. You can get in contact with ProBrand via the number on the screen, 0800 015 7299, or by visiting our website at www.probrand.co.uk. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.